Hello, everyone. Welcome. This week's review is Iron Gold by Pierce Brown. It was released on January 16th, 2018, and it has 596 pages, and it is of the sci-fi genre. If any of you have been following my channel for the past few weeks, besides last week, I did the first three installments of the book, of the series, which was Red Rising, Golden Sun, and Morning Star. And when I read those three books, I thought, okay, I'm done. The trilogy's done. Little did I know that maybe the reason that those books were being so marketed was because at the beginning of this year, this book came out. Now I thought, okay, the series is kind of concluded at that point, but obviously there was a lot of things left. I would have thought to our interpretation. Now, this book, what happens is it takes place 10 years after the end of Morning Star, whereas the first three books were kind of like in close succession, especially when one book would end. No, when the first book ended, it was maybe 2 years later, and then when the second book ended, it was about like months later. This is 10 full years later. A lot has changed, and I'm not going to get into the premise of the whole story so I don't ruin the whole, I guess, saga, but what I will say is there was a major revolution, and the main character, Darrow, was fighting for change. He made things happen, found love, etc. And now he's kind of sucked into this world of like, okay, this revolution isn't over. There's still threats on both sides of the solar system because this book takes place not only on Earth. Actually, the majority of the originals were about Mars. And then what happened was he basically took over control of the core, which is the inner planets of our solar system as we know it. But this is about 1,000 years into the future. Now, anyway, I'm not going to get too much into it, but what makes this book really interesting is that the biggest difference, that if you've read the first three and haven't read this one yet, the biggest difference is that the first three were only in the first person perspective of Darrow himself. That's it. This one is not only Darrow's perspective, but there's different chapters for different characters, and there's 4 of them total. One being Darrow, and the other being Lyria, who is a red, which is the same kind of class that Darrow came from, so she's a lower class. Then there's Ephraim, who's a gray, which is kind of like a soldier class, but he's going through some kind of depression and hating. He thinks that this is a false revolution and no one's being saved. Lyria has that same kind of sentiment, whereas like, oh, this guy who was supposed to be like of my people is supposedly trying to free everybody, but he's done nothing for me and my family. Like, I'm watching people suffer still and blah, blah, blah. And then the fourth perspective is a character that was somewhat introduced as a child in the original series, and his name was Lysander. And he is a gold, which is like the highest class of society, and he's kind of conflicted because he's struggling between accepting the new ways of life and clinging on to the old. And he sees a beacon of hope for him that it's like, oh, now I could potentially restore order to the solar system by like doing certain things. And I'm not going to get into like the how the plot develops for each of these characters, but the only thing to note is that the three, Lyria and Ephraim, their plots kind of intertwine with each other, and they affect Darrow's plot line. However, Lysander's, I believe, his plot line will kind of bring an overarching story to this whole thing. So the original trilogy was a trilogy, so I'm like, okay, it's over and done with. Maybe this was, before I even knew anything, I'm like, oh, this is probably a prequel. Then I looked into it, I'm like, okay, I just explained this is after the fact, 10 years later. I thought, it being such a large, it's actually the largest installment of the book, of the series. I'm like, oh, maybe it's just one story. But it ends on a cliffhanger. So I'm thinking that this might be another trilogy or maybe a two-parter. But anyway, the reason I'm so like kind of amped up and excited is because this was a series I discovered and this year, and I thought, I've read so many books, obviously, but this one really, I don't know, for whatever reason, really got me excited. And now I thought I was done, and now I'm like, oh, now I gotta wait for another one. And most of the books I've reviewed so far have been kind of concluded series, except maybe these guys, where these two, I've been like waiting for the next ones. But yeah, anyway, I'm really excited for this. I hope it comes out around the same time the other books did, like in January of each year. Yeah, so check out Iron Gold, Pierce Brown. Check out his first 3 books. If you haven't read this one, you will not understand what's going on at all. The characters have been built up so much from the previous ones that I think it's extremely necessary to read those before you even try to read this. Because this one even took me a while to, because they're introducing new characters as well. So it took me a while to realize how they relate to the older characters too. Because everyone somehow gets connected with an older character in some way. All the narrators, I should say. That's Iron Gold, sci-fi, future. If you're into that kind of stuff, if you like the kind of Game of Thrones vibe, you'll definitely like this. It's Game of Thrones light in the solar system, in my opinion. That's all I have to say, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.